am a world-class coward. So when a stale crouton got stuck in my throat and woke up as Princess Penelope, the doomed second princess of a fantasy romance novel, I didn't plot revenge or try to win the emperor's favor. I faked my death, ran to a sleepy coastal town, and opened a pastel-themed bakery called the Sugar Cloud. My plan was flawless. Bake cakes, live quietly, and absolutely avoid General Silas Blackwood, the terrifying military commander and chief executioner fated to put an end to my life for treason. But my peaceful life is shattered when a brooding, terrifyingly handsome giant walks into my shop. It's the general. I think he's here to arrest me, but it turns out the most dangerous man in the empire just has a secret, desperate obsession with my strawberry cream tarts. And soon, an obsession with the baker herself. They say love is unpredictable, and today's story proves it. Welcome to Romance Crave Stories, where every episode is full of passion, secrets, and emotional twists. Let's begin. I am, and always have been, a spectacular coward. Spiders? I surrender the house to them. Confrontation? I'd rather apologize to a lamppost for bumping into it. So you can imagine my sheer, unadulterated panic when I choked on a stale crouton in my past life and woke up in the lavish, velvet-draped bedchamber of Princess Penelope Sterling, the notorious, spoiled second princess of the Sterling Empire. A best-selling fantasy novel. Unfortunately for me, Princess Penelope was destined for a very short, very pointy future. According to the book, she gets executed in chapter 20 for a failed coup by order of her own father, carried out by the emperor's most fearsome commander and chief executioner, General Silas Blackwood. Silas was described as a massive, brooding mountain of a man with eyes like winter ice and a heavy broadsword named Mercy, that had seen far too many battlefields. I had zero interest in court politics, poisoning the crown prince, or meeting the business end of Mercy. I just wanted to live. So using my ultimate cowardice as a superpower, I executed a flawless, panic-fueled escape. I faked my own demise by leaving a dramatic suicide note near a treacherous river, packed a sack of stolen royal jewels, and fled to the furthest, sleepiest edge of the empire, the coastal town of Oakhaven. There, I poured my stolen fortune into my one true passion. I transformed an abandoned cobblestone shop into a pastel-hued haven of pink awnings, soft mint green walls, and the perpetual, comforting scent of vanilla and melted butter. I named it the Sugar Cloud, and for 2 glorious years, my biggest crisis was a collapsed souffle. I wore flour-dusted aprons, hid my striking silver hair under a mob cap, and lived in cozy, glorious obscurity. Then he walked in. The little brass bell above the door chimed, and all the light in the room seemed to get sucked into the black hole of the man standing in my entryway. He was obnoxiously tall, clad in heavy, dark armor that clinked with every step, and possessed a scowl that could curdle fresh cream. He looked like death incarnate on a casual Tuesday afternoon. "Welcome to the Sugar Cloud," I squeaked, my voice cracking so hard I sounded like a startled mouse. I ducked behind the glass display case, clutching a pastry bag like a defensive weapon. "How can I help you?" The man's icy blue eyes locked onto mine. My soul attempted to leave my body. It was him, General Silas Blackwood. He had found me. He was here to drag me back to the capital for my execution. He took a slow, heavy step forward. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for my inevitable doom. "Do you?" His deep, gravelly voice rumbled, shaking the delicate teacups on their shelves. "Have any more of those strawberry cream tarts with the little sugar daisies on top?" I opened one eye. "Pardon?" "The strawberry tarts," the terror of the empire repeated, a faint, almost embarrassed pink dusting his sharp cheekbones. "I bought one yesterday. It was adequate. I require 3 more. Chapter 1. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the sugar cloud was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the frantic, syncopated thumping of my own terrified heart. I stayed crouched behind the glass pastry case, my hands strangling the canvas piping bag. I stared at the towering wall of dark leather and iron armor filling my doorway. General Silas Blackwood, the chief executioner, the man whose broadsword was supposed to separate my head from my royal shoulders, was looking at me not with the cold calculation of an assassin, but with the subtle desperation of a man having a sugar craving. 3. I squeaked out, slowly raising my head above the glass. "You want 3 strawberry cream tarts?" "If you have them," Silas replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated right through the floorboards. He shifted his weight, his armor clinking ominously. He looked entirely out of place in my cozy sanctuary. The sugar cloud was a carefully curated haven of soft life aesthetics. The walls were painted a calming mint green, the display mats were soft cream, and plush pink cushions rested on every wrought iron chair. Silas, standing there in his midnight black combat gear, looked like a thundercloud that had accidentally wandered into a marshmallow factory. Ah yes. Right away, my lord. Sir. General. Customer. I mentally slapped myself. Pull it together, Penelope. With trembling hands, I set down the piping bag and grabbed a pair of silver tongs. I carefully extracted 3 of my finest tarts from the display. They were a masterpiece of pastel perfection. A buttery, flaky crust filled with a mountain of whipped vanilla bean cream, topped with fresh, glazed strawberries, and finished with delicate little daisies made of spun pink sugar. I slid them onto a delicate porcelain plate painted with tiny roses, completely expecting him to draw his sword the moment I stepped out from behind the counter. Instead, he just watched the pastries with an intensity that most generals reserved for enemy troop movements. I shuffled over to the counter and pushed the plate toward him. That will be 30 copper pieces, please. Silas reached into a heavy leather pouch at his belt. His hand was massive, scarred, and calloused from years of wielding heavy weaponry. He dropped a single, gleaming gold coin onto the counter. It was enough to buy the entire display case, the display case itself, and probably the front door. Keep the change, he muttered. Before I could protest, he took the plate, turned around, and marched toward the corner of the bakery. I watched in stunned silence as the Empire's most lethal military commander squeezed his massive frame into a dainty, cream-colored booth meant for small ladies gossiping over tea. His knees practically touched his chin. He didn't seem to care. He picked up the first tiny silver pastry fork, looked at it for a second as if wondering how such a useless weapon could exist, and then abandoned it entirely. With 2 fingers, he picked up a strawberry tart. He took a bite. I held my breath. If it was too sweet, would he arrest me? If the crust was soggy, would he declare martial law on my bakery? Silas closed his eyes. The terrifying, permanent scowl on his face smoothed out just a fraction. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips. Within exactly 45 seconds, all 3 tarts had vanished, leaving nothing but a dusting of pink sugar on the porcelain plate. He sat there for a moment in the quiet, pastel-lit room, looking out the window at the sleepy coastal street. The tension in his broad shoulders seemed to melt away into the vanilla-scented air. For a fleeting second, he didn't look like the ruthless executioner sent to hunt down the treasonous second princess. He just looked like a very tired man who really liked strawberries. Then the moment passed. Silas stood up, the booth creaking in relief, and adjusted his heavy cloak. He strode back to the door, pausing just as his hand touched the brass handle. He didn't turn around, but his deep voice echoed through the shop. The pink sugar flowers. They are a nice touch. And with that, the general walked out, the little bell chiming merrily in his wake. I collapsed against the counter, my knees finally giving out. I was alive. My head was still attached to my neck. But as I stared at the gold coin resting next to the cash register, a new, far more terrifying realization dawned on me. He liked the tarts. Which meant the man destined to kill me was probably going to become a regular. Chapter 2. In the history of the Sterling Empire, 3 p.m. had never been considered an inherently terrifying time of day. For most people in Oakhaven, it was the hour of afternoon tea, sleepy yawns, and the gentle coastal breeze. For me, it became the hour of the executioner. True to my absolute worst fears, General Silas Blackwood did not just stop by the sugar cloud as a one-time fluke. He returned the very next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every afternoon, just as the grandfather clock chimed 3 times, the cheerful little brass bell above my door would ring. My heart would plummet into my flour-dusted shoes, and the towering mountain of dark armor and lethal weaponry would step into my haven of soft pinks and creams. Living in a state of constant, sweaty terror is incredibly exhausting. By day 4, in a desperate attempt to keep my heart beating through the sheer panic of my impending daily doom, I accidentally invented a new beverage. I frantically whisked finely ground green tea leaves with steamed milk, topping it with a massive, floating dollop of whipped sweet vanilla cream to soothe my nerves. I dubbed it the matcha cloud latte. It tasted like cozy, grassy heaven and contained enough caffeine to let me see sounds. I drank 3 of them before 2 p.m. just to ensure my legs wouldn't give out when Silas inevitably walked through the door. Welcome to the sugar cloud. I chirped on day 5, my voice buzzing with the manic energy of a woman who was over-caffeinated and under severe threat of decapitation. Silas paused in the doorway. He looked at me, his icy blue eyes narrowing slightly under his dark brow. I gripped the countertop so hard my knuckles turned white, convinced he had finally recognized the doomed second princess beneath the oversized mob cap. Instead, his gaze dropped to the glass display case. You are out of the strawberry ones. His voice was a flat, rumbling baritone, but I swear I detected the faintest hint of devastation. Yes. I am so sorry, my Lord General. I stammered, bowing so quickly I nearly hit my head on the glass. A minor tragedy with the oven this morning. But I have a fresh batch of blueberry scones with lemon glaze, and some vanilla bean macarons. Silas stared at the macarons. They were delicate, pastel pink, and roughly the size of a single joint on his massive, battle-scarred thumb. He looked deeply skeptical. I will take 5 of the pink ones, he finally muttered, tossing another absurdly large gold coin onto the counter. I really must insist on giving you change, sir, I squeaked, pushing the gold coin back. This could buy a horse. Silas frowned, a terrifying expression that made my soul attempt to flee my body. He pushed the coin back toward me with one massive finger. Keep it. For the baking. I didn't argue further. I boxed up his pastel pink macarons, tying the little white box with a soft pink ribbon, because branding is important even when you are dealing with the Empire's most lethal killer. Just like every other day, he didn't leave immediately. He took his little box, squeezed his terrifying frame into the delicate cream-colored booth in the corner, and methodically ate his pastel cookies while staring out the window. From the safety of the kitchen doorway, I clutched my matcha cloud latte and watched him. It was a bizarre, jarring contrast. The general was a man built for war, all sharp edges, dark leather, and imposing silence. Yet here he was, seeking refuge in a shop that smelled of melted butter, surrounded by mint green walls and floral cushions. He finished his last macaron, meticulously wiped a stray crumb of pink almond shell from his chin, and stood up. As he walked past the counter, he didn't look at me, but he paused. The pink ones, Silas said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, were also adequate. But see to it that the strawberry tarts are reinstated by tomorrow. Yes, General. I saluted, immediately realizing how stupid I looked holding a whisk. He gave a sharp single nod and left the shop. I slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor until I was sitting on the checkerboard tiles. I took a shaky sip of my latte. I was surviving. Somehow, by the grace of butter and sugar. The chief executioner was eating out of the palm of my hand. But I knew my luck couldn't hold forever. After all, I was the most spectacularly clumsy coward in the Empire. It was only a matter of time before I messed up. Chapter 3. For the past week, I had successfully managed to keep my head attached to my shoulders by employing a very strict, 2-step survival strategy. Bake exceptional strawberry pastries, and try not to faint when General Silas Blackwood walked through my door. To distract myself from my impending 3 p.m. doom, I had spent the entire morning locked in a state of cozy bakery focus. I was determined to perfect my newest concoction. A towering, blush-pink strawberry shortcake milkshake, topped with a mountain of whipped cream and a dusting of crushed biscuit crumbs. It matched the soft pinks and creams of the sugar cloud perfectly, and it gave me something to do with my nervous energy. I was just wiping down the glass display case when the delivery boy, little Timmy, burst through the front door, dropping a heavy sack of flour and a bundle of broadsheets on the counter. "Morning, Miss Penny. Market news for you," he chirped, before darting back out into the coastal sunshine. I smiled, humming a little tune as I untied the bundle of broadsheets. My smile vanished instantly. Staring back at me, printed in stark, unforgiving black ink on the front page of the capital's Royal Gazette, was my own face. Wanted, Princess Penelope Sterling. For high treason. Reward, 50,000 gold pieces. Dead or alive. Beneath the headline was a remarkably accurate sketch of my aristocratic nose and the distinctive, star-shaped birthmark on my neck. My breath hitched in my throat. I had been hiding out in Oakhaven for 2 years. Why was the Emperor suddenly renewing the bounty now? Ding. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 3. Simultaneously, the cheerful brass bell above the door jingled. The temperature in the room plummeted. The doorway darkened as General Silas Blackwood stepped inside. Looking every inch the lethal, brooding executioner he was born to be. Panic seized my brain. The wanted poster was sitting directly on the counter, face up, right where Silas would place his gold coin. If he saw it, he would look at the sketch, look at me, and then introduce my neck to the giant broadsword strapped to his back. I had to cover it. I had to hide it. Now. Moving with the desperate agility of a cornered rabbit, I lunged for the nearest object. A massive stainless steel mixing bowl filled to the brim with freshly sifted powdered sugar. I hoisted it up, intending to casually set it down right on top of my printed face. Unfortunately, my foot caught the edge of the flour sack Timmy had left on the floor. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. My arms flailed wildly. The bowl slipped from my grasp, launching itself into the air like a poorly aimed catapult. I squeezed my eyes shut and braced for impact, expecting to crash into the hard wooden floor. Instead, I collided with something solid, warm, and distinctly wrapped in leather armor. Whoosh! A massive, suffocating cloud of white exploded into the air, raining down like a localized blizzard inside my mint green bakery. I coughed, slowly opening my eyes. I was sprawled awkwardly on the checkerboard floor. Standing above me was the most terrifying man in the Sterling Empire. Only now his midnight black hair, his imposing dark armor, and his permanent lethal scowl were entirely caked in a thick, snowy layer of powdered sugar. He looked like a giant, very angry, heavily armed marshmallow. I froze. This was it. This was how I died. Murdered over a pastry counter, dusted in my own confectioner's sugar. Silas blinked slowly. A small puff of white powder plumed from his eyelashes. He looked down at me, his icy blue eyes piercing through the sweet, hazy cloud settling around us. He didn't reach for his sword. He didn't bellow for the guards. Instead, the general slowly lowered himself to one knee. He reached out a massive, heavily scarred hand, the leather of his gauntlet now dusted in stark white. "Are you injured?" he asked. His deep rumble of a voice was entirely devoid of anger. It was gentle. I stared at his extended hand, my heart executing a frantic, confusing flip-flop against my ribs that had absolutely nothing to do with terror. "And no," I stammered, gingerly placing my small, floury hand into his massive one. His grip was surprisingly careful, like he was afraid he might break me, as he effortlessly pulled me back to my feet. "Good," Silas murmured. He grabbed a cloth napkin from a nearby table and, to my absolute shock, gently dabbed a smudge of sugar off my cheek. The callous heat of his fingers brushed against my skin, sending a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. He stepped back, clearing his throat and hastily brushing a pound of sugar off his armored chest plate. He deliberately looked away from me, a faint, undeniable pink dusting the tips of his ears. "I will," he grumbled, staring intensely at a blank spot on the wall. "Take 3 strawberry tarts. If you have them." I swallowed hard, my cheeks burning hotter than my ovens. The wanted poster was safely buried under a snowy dune of sugar on the counter. My secret was safe. But as I hurried to fetch his tarts, my perpetually terrified heart realized it was in a completely different, entirely new kind of danger. Chapter 4. Ever since the powdered sugar incident, the atmosphere inside the sugar cloud had shifted from cozy coastal bakery to highly volatile emotional war zone. My survival strategy was completely falling apart. I was supposed to be terrified of General Silas Blackwood. I was supposed to view him as the looming specter of my own execution. Instead, every time the brass bell chimed at 3 p.m., my stomach did a treasonous little flip, and I found myself frantically smoothing my apron. I stood in the back kitchen, desperately trying to focus on zesting lemons for a fresh batch of bars. I pulled my striking silver hair back, securing it tightly with a soft pink scrunchie I had crocheted myself out of leftover baby wool, before firmly pinning my oversized mob cap over the whole thing. I had to keep my identity hidden. I could not afford to get distracted just because the Empire's most lethal weapon had surprisingly gentle hands. But I wasn't the only one distracted by the General's daily presence. The entire town of Oakhaven had noticed. It was impossible not to notice. Silas wasn't exactly subtle. He was a mountain of dark steel and brooding muscle who parked himself in a pastel pink booth meant for dainty tea parties. Word spread quickly that the chief executioner had developed a crippling addiction to my baked goods, and the locals didn't know whether to be fascinated or horrified. On a busy Thursday afternoon, the bakery was packed with a long line of gossiping townsfolk. I was rushing back and forth, boxing up cupcakes and pulling fresh bread from the ovens, when the clock struck 3. The bell chimed. The chatter in the room instantly died. The sea of customers parted like the Red Sea as Silas stepped through the door. He didn't even look at them. His icy blue gaze locked onto the glass display case, sweeping over the shelves with tactical precision. He frowned. I followed his gaze. Sitting on the middle shelf, next to a ceramic bunny, was a single solitary lemon crumble bar. It was his secondary favorite pastry for the days when the strawberry tarts sold out early. Unfortunately, Mrs. Higgins, the mayor's elderly and notoriously chatty wife, was currently at the front of the line, pointing a wrinkled finger directly at it. "I'll take that lovely little lemon bar, dear," Mrs. Higgins chirped, completely oblivious to the sudden drop in room temperature. Silas stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head, his dark eyes fixing on Mrs. Higgins with the intensity of a predator locking onto its prey. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just stood there, all 6 foot something of terrifying military might, and glared. It was a glare that had broken enemy sieges. It was a glare that had forced foreign kings to surrender. Mrs. Higgins paused. She slowly turned her head, following the invisible, freezing laser beam of Silas's stare back to its source. She looked at the giant, heavily armed man. She looked back at the tiny yellow pastry. "You know what?" Mrs. Higgins squeaked, suddenly clutching her pearls. "My doctor said I need to cut back on citrus. Acid reflux, you see? I'll just take a plain croissant. No, wait, I don't need anything at all. Good day, Penelope." She scurried out of the shop faster than a woman with a bad hip had any right to move. Silas gave a sharp, satisfied nod. He marched up to the counter, entirely ignoring the terrified, wide-eyed line of customers behind him, and placed a gold coin on the glass. "The lemon bar," he rumbled. "General," I whispered, leaning over the counter, my face flushing. "You cannot just terrorize my customers into giving up their pastries." "I did nothing," Silas replied smoothly, his face a mask of absolute innocence. She remembered her medical condition. "It was very fortunate for my appetite." I groaned, burying my face in my hands. But things only escalated from there. Having successfully secured his lemon bar, Silas apparently decided that the chaotic, milling crowd in my bakery was highly inefficient. As he squeezed into his usual cream-colored booth, he took one look at the disorganized line of customers and sighed, a heavy, long-suffering sound. He stood back up. "Form a single file line," his voice boomed across the pastel room, rattling the teacups. "Have your copper pieces ready before you reach the counter. Indecision will not be tolerated. Move." The townsfolk, terrified out of their wits, instantly snapped into a perfectly straight, militaristic formation. Nobody dared to take longer than 3 seconds to order. Nobody dared to ask if the muffins were gluten-free. They simply paid, took their boxes, and marched out under the watchful, icy stare of the chief executioner. I stood behind the cash register, utterly speechless. I had successfully evaded death, only to accidentally acquire a heavily armored, terrifyingly effective bouncer. Silas sat back down, taking a delicate bite of his lemon bar, looking immensely pleased with himself. And as I watched him, a horrifying realization washed over me. I wasn't just failing to be afraid of him. I was actually starting to like him. Chapter 5. For a solid month, my life settled into a bizarre functional rhythm. I baked. The town of Oakhaven formed single file, highly disciplined lines to buy my pastries, and the Empire's most feared military commander acted as my unofficial, unpaid, heavily armored security guard. Then disaster struck. It wasn't the Emperor's scouts or royal assassins. It was something far worse, a man named Francois. Francois was a baker from the capital who possessed a fiercely waxed mustache, an inflated sense of superiority, and a frankly alarming amount of funding. He bought the large, empty storefront directly across the cobblestone street from the sugar cloud. Overnight, he transformed it into L'Épée d'Or, a stark, modern monstrosity of black iron, dark oak and pretentious, gold leaf lettering. "He doesn't even use fresh butter," I hissed, peering through my mint green curtains on opening day. I saw his delivery boy. "It's all cheap lard." "And what is that? A deconstructed artisan brioche?" "It's just a burnt roll on a slate tile." Despite my righteous indignation, Oakhaven was a small town, and novelty was a powerful lure. The locals, perhaps tired of the sheer military discipline required to buy a cupcake at my shop, began to trickle across the street. By 2 p.m. on Francois's first day, the sugar cloud was painfully quiet. I had an entire tray of wild berry muffins sitting untouched on the counter. I slumped onto a stool, resting my chin in my hands, fighting the irrational urge to cry over a batch of baked goods. At exactly 3 p.m., the brass bell chimed. General Silas Blackwood stepped inside, ducking slightly to avoid hitting the doorframe. He took exactly 2 steps before he stopped. His icy blue eyes swept over the completely empty bakery, landing on my miserable, slumped form. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. "Where?" Silas rumbled, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his broadsword. "Is everyone?" "Across the street," I mumbled, gesturing weakly out the window. "A new baker moved in. He makes savory tarts with truffles and charges 10 times what I do. I think I'm ruined." Silas turned his head slowly, peering through the glass at the sleek, crowded storefront of Lepi d'Or. He stared at it for a long, terrifying minute. A muscle feathered in his sharp jawline. "I see," he said softly. It was the kind of soft that preceded a massive cavalry charge. "Box up the muffins. All of them." "What? Why?" "Box them," he repeated, turning on his heel. "I will return shortly." Before I could ask what he was doing, he strode out the door. I scrambled to the window, pressing my nose against the glass just in time to see the chief executioner cross the street and plant himself directly in front of the door to Lepi d'Or. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, arms crossed over his massive, dark chest plate, blocking the entrance completely. His brow was furrowed into a scowl so dark it practically absorbed the afternoon sunlight. A moment later, Mrs. Higgins waddled up the street, aiming for the new bakery. Silas didn't move. He just tilted his head down and fixed her with a freezing, unblinking glare. I couldn't hear what was said, but Mrs. Higgins stopped so fast she nearly tipped over backwards. She pointed a trembling finger at the gold leaf sign. Silas shook his head once, very slowly, and pointed a massive, leather-clad finger back across the street toward the sugar cloud. Mrs. Higgins executed a flawless military-about face and practically sprinted toward my door. "1 wild berry muffin, please, Penelope," she gasped, bursting into my shop, slapping a handful of coppers onto the counter. "And make it quick." Over the next 20 minutes, it was a massacre. Silas stood his ground like a human siege engine. Every time a townsman approached the rival bakery, the general would unleash a glare of such concentrated, lethal disappointment that they immediately folded. "T2 muffins, Miss Penelope," the town blacksmith stammered, shuffling into my shop a moment later, refusing to make eye contact. "3 for me," squeaked the local schoolteacher. Francois, noticing his sudden lack of customers, burst out of his front door, waving a rolling pin and shouting in outrage at the giant blocking his business. Silas didn't even blink. He slowly unclasped his heavy cloak, letting it fall back to reveal the full, terrifying size of the broadsword strapped to his back. Francois dropped his rolling pin, turned pale white, and locked his own front door from the inside. At exactly 3:45 p.m., Silas strolled back into the sugar cloud. The muffin tray was completely empty. I was standing behind the register, clutching a bag of coins, caught somewhere between utter horror and profound, fluttering gratitude. Silas walked up to the counter and placed his usual gold coin on the glass. "The tactical situation has been resolved," he stated, his voice completely level. "I require 3 strawberry tarts." I slid the delicate plate of pastries across the counter, looking up at him. "You can't just blockade my competition, General." Silas picked up a tart, a faint, dangerous smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "It was not a blockade. It was a strategic reassignment of civilian resources. Your pastries are superior. I was simply correcting a lapse in their judgment." He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, his icy eyes warming just a fraction. My heart executed a violent somersault. I was doomed. The executioner wasn't going to cut off my head. He was going to steal my heart, and he was doing it one baked good at a time. Chapter 6. Running a successful bakery required 2 things: an ironclad sense of timing and fresh ingredients. Usually, I enjoyed my weekly trips to the Oakhaven open-air market. It was a chance to get out of the kitchen and breathe in the salty sea air. But today, my nerves were completely frayed. Rumor had it that a battalion of the Emperor's Royal Scouts was passing through the province. To calm my racing heart before leaving the shop, I sat by the window in a patch of morning sunlight, trying to focus on my favorite distraction. I was meticulously working on a soft pink halter top, hooking the baby wool with a sturdy 5mm metal needle. I had completely given up on bamboo needles after snapping 3 of them during particularly stressful baking emergencies. The rhythmic, repetitive motion of the metal hook was supposed to be soothing. It was working, right up until a massive shadow eclipsed the sun. I looked up. General Silas Blackwood was standing on the other side of the window, staring through the glass at my crochet hook, as if it were a highly classified weapon. He pushed the front door open, the brass bell jingling wildly. It was only 9 a.m. General, I blinked, hastily stuffing the pink wool into my apron pocket. You're early. The strawberry tarts won't be ready until 3. I am aware of the schedule, Silas stated, his heavy boots echoing on the checkerboard floor. He was out of his full plate armor today, wearing a dark leather tunic that somehow made his broad shoulders look even wider. Timmy, the delivery boy, informed me that you were walking to the market this morning. Unescorted. I stared at him. Yes. It's Tuesday. I need fresh vanilla beans and butter. Oakhaven Market is a chaotic, unregulated civilian zone. Silas rumbled, crossing his arms. There are pickpockets, runaway carts, unpredictable livestock. I will escort you. That is entirely unnecessary. I squeaked, panic instantly bubbling in my chest. Walking to the market was one thing. Walking to the market with the Empire's most recognizable, terrifying chief executioner, while Royal Scouts were in town, was basically painting a giant target on my back. I am perfectly safe. It's just vegetables. Vegetable vendors are notoriously aggressive, Silas countered without missing a beat. Get your basket, Penelope. We are leaving. 10 minutes later, I was shuffling down the cobblestone street, clutching my woven basket with white knuckles. Silas walked beside me. Calling it an escort was a gross understatement. He flanked me like a heavily armed warship protecting a very small, very nervous dinghy. The Oakhaven Market was bustling with farmers, fishermen, and merchants. The moment we stepped into the square, the usual roar of haggling and laughter abruptly died down. People took one look at Silas's towering, dark figure and his permanent lethal scowl, and practically threw themselves out of our way. We walked through the densely packed market in a bubble of complete, terrified silence. See, Silas murmured, leaning down slightly. A highly tactical approach. We have secured a perimeter. You are traumatizing the local agriculture sector, I hissed, keeping my head down, praying my oversized mob cap was securely pinned. We stopped at a fruit stall. The vendor, a burly man who usually yelled at me for taking too long to pick my berries, took one look at Silas and went deathly pale. I need 3 baskets of strawberries, I said softly. The vendor immediately grabbed 3 baskets of sad, slightly bruised berries from the front of the display. Before I could say a word, Silas stepped forward. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed one massive, leather-gloved hand on the wooden stall and leaned in, his icy blue eyes locking onto the vendor's soul. Those, Silas rumbled, are subpar. The baker requires the premium harvest. The ones you keep hidden in the back for the mayor. The vendor swallowed so hard I heard it over the bleating of a nearby sheep. Why yes, my lord. Right away, my lord. He scrambled under the table, emerging with the largest, reddest, most flawless strawberries I had ever seen in my life. Silas gave a sharp nod of approval, tossing a silver coin onto the table, vastly overpaying as usual. He picked up the baskets effortlessly. Next target. I couldn't help it. A small, genuine laugh escaped my lips. He was completely ridiculous, and yet, watching the fearsome general apply military siege tactics to grocery shopping was incredibly endearing. But my smile vanished a second later. At the far end of the square, past the cheese wheels and hanging linens, I saw them. 3 men in the distinctive crimson and gold tunics of the Emperor's Royal Scouts. They were holding up a piece of parchment, a wanted poster, and showing it to a merchant. My blood ran cold. My feet rooted to the cobblestones. If they saw me, if they saw him with me, it was over. Silas noticed my sudden stop. He followed my terrified gaze across the market. I braced myself for the moment he would recognize his own soldiers, connect the dots, and hand me over. Instead, Silas moved with terrifying speed. Before the scouts could even turn their heads in our direction, he stepped directly in front of me. His massive frame completely blocked me from their line of sight. He reached out, wrapping a heavy, warm arm around my shoulders, and swiftly pulled me into the narrow, shadowed alleyway between the bakeries and a spice shop. He pressed me back against the cool brick wall, stepping in so close that all I could see was the dark leather of his tunic. All I could smell was leather, steel, and the faint, sweet scent of the vanilla macarons he had eaten yesterday. "Quiet," he breathed, his gravelly voice barely a whisper, his hand resting securely against the wall just beside my head. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We stood there in the shadows, chests nearly touching, as the heavy footsteps of the Royal Scouts walked past the mouth of the alley. I looked up into Silas's eyes. He wasn't looking at the Scouts. He was looking down at me, his gaze entirely focused, intense, and surprisingly protective. For the first time since waking up in this novel, I realized that the man destined to kill me might be the only person in the world keeping me safe. Chapter 7. We survived the market. Or rather, Silas successfully smuggled me back to the sugar cloud without a single Royal Scout spotting my face. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the coastal sky in shades of bruised purple and soft tangerine, my nerves were completely shot. I had locked the front door, flipped the little wooden sign to closed, and retreated to the safety of my kitchen. Usually, this was my favorite time of day. The bakery was quiet, filled only with the residual warmth of the ovens and the comforting, heavy scent of toasted sugar and melted butter. But tonight, the quiet was heavy. The memory of the alleyway, the heat of Silas's chest, the terrifying, protective intensity in his icy blue eyes, was replaying in my mind on an endless loop. I aggressively scrubbed a floury mixing bowl in the iron sink, trying to scrub away my treasonous thoughts along with the dough. "You are going to wear a hole through the metal," a deep voice rumbled from the doorway. I jumped, nearly dropping the wet bowl. I clutched my chest and spun around. Silas was leaning against the kitchen doorframe. He had taken off his heavy armor plates and left them in the front room, wearing only his dark leather tunic and a linen shirt underneath. Without the jagged steel, he looked less like an executioner and more like a weary, incredibly handsome man. "I thought you left," I breathed, quickly wiping my hands on my apron. "I wanted to ensure the perimeter was clear," Silas said softly. He stepped into the kitchen. He looked entirely too large for the space, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the hanging bundles of dried lavender and chamomile. "The Scouts have moved on toward the northern ridge. You are safe." "Thank you," I whispered, looking down at my worn leather shoes. Silas didn't leave. Instead, he pulled out a small wooden stool, the one I used to reach the highest shelves, and sat down. The stool creaked ominously under his weight, but it held. He rested his elbows on his knees, clasping his large, scarred hands together. He looked exhausted. The permanent, intimidating scowl had melted away, leaving behind deep lines of sheer, soul-crushing fatigue around his eyes. Can I get you anything?" I asked hesitantly. "I have a leftover slice of vanilla sponge. Or some chamomile tea." "No," Silas sighed, leaning his head back against the mint green wall and closing his eyes. "Just the quiet. If you do not mind." I didn't mind. In fact, my heart gave a strange, painful little squeeze at the sight of him. I picked up a soft linen cloth and began drying the mixing bowl, watching him out of the corner of my eye. "Why do you come here, General?" The question slipped out before my cowardly brain could stop it. "And I don't mean for the strawberry tarts. You are the chief executioner of the Sterling Empire. You command legions. Yet you spend your afternoons sitting in a pink booth, policing my muffin inventory." Silas was silent for a long time. I thought he might be angry that I had dared to question him. But when he finally opened his eyes, they weren't cold. They were painfully vulnerable. "Because," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "the capital is a graveyard, Penelope. It is built on paranoia, poison, and blood. Every day I am surrounded by people who are plotting to kill each other, or people I am ordered to kill myself. The stones of the palace are cold. The air smells of iron." He slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the warm, flour-dusted kitchen, the jars of pastel sprinkles, and the soft pink curtains rustling in the evening breeze. "Then I walked into this place," he continued softly. "It is the only place in the Empire that does not feel like a battlefield. It smells like vanilla. The walls are bright. And you." He looked back at me, his icy eyes locking onto mine with a sudden, fierce intensity. "You are the only person I have met in years who looks at me and only sees a man who wants a pastry, not a weapon to be used." A heavy, suffocating wave of guilt crashed over me. So strong it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. He thought I was innocent. He found sanctuary in my bakery because he believed it was completely untouched by the poison of the capital. He had absolutely no idea that the baker he was looking at with such quiet reverence was Princess Penelope, the disgraced villainess, the catalyst of the very political rot he despised, and the woman he was under direct orders to execute. I was a walking, breathing lie. "Silas," I whispered, my voice trembling. The urge to confess, to rip off my mob cap and show him my silver hair and royal birthmark, clawed at my throat. I didn't want to lie to him anymore. I wanted to tell him everything. He stood up from the stool and crossed the small kitchen in 2 long strides. Before I could back away, he reached out. He didn't draw his sword. Instead, his massive, calloused hand gently cupped my cheek. His thumb brushed lightly against my jawline, devastatingly tender. "You do not need to be afraid of me, Penelope," he murmured, completely misinterpreting the terrified, guilt-ridden tears welling in my eyes. "I would burn the empire to the ground before I let anyone bring the darkness of the capital to your door." A single tear spilled over my lashes, tracking down my cheek to wet his leather glove. I closed my eyes and leaned into his warmth, completely terrified, entirely consumed by guilt, and hopelessly, irretrievably in love with my executioner. Chapter 8. The sky over Oakhaven didn't just darken. It turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and threatening. By 4 o'clock, the heavens tore open, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the cobblestone streets into raging, muddy rivers. Inside the sugar cloud, the cozy atmosphere was working overtime to combat the gloom. I had lit every vanilla-scented candle I owned, casting a warm, flickering glow over the mint-green walls and pastel display cases. I stood by the window, watching the rain violently lash against the glass. The brass bell hadn't chimed in hours. The town had entirely shut down. Except, of course, for the massive, heavily armed man sitting in the corner booth. General Silas Blackwood was nursing a cup of black tea, watching the storm with the calm, detached expression of a man who had survived significantly worse weather on a battlefield. "You can't leave in this," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. A crack of thunder shook the floorboards, emphasizing my point. "The streets are completely flooded. You'd be washed out to the harbor before you made it halfway to the garrison." Silas took a slow sip of his tea. "I have marched through monsoons, Penelope. A little coastal rain will not melt me." "You are wearing 50 pounds of iron and leather," I pointed out, gesturing to his boots. "You won't melt, you'll sink. And I refuse to let the Empire's chief executioner drown outside my bakery. It would be terrible for business." A low, rumbling chuckle vibrated in his chest. A sound so rare and unexpectedly warm that it made my toes curl inside my shoes. "Very well," Silas conceded, standing up. "I surrender to your tactical assessment. Where do you propose we establish a base camp?" "The back parlor," I said, locking the front door and pulling the pink linen blinds shut. "It has a fireplace." My attached living quarters were tiny, consisting mostly of a small hearth, a plush cream-colored sofa, and a woven rug. It was my sanctuary, smelling permanently of cinnamon and old books. Silas stepped into the parlor, and immediately made the room look about the size of a dollhouse. He took off his heavy leather cloak, which was dripping wet from when he had gone outside to help me secure the storm shutters, and hung it on a sturdy iron hook. Underneath, his linen shirt clung to his broad shoulders, slightly damp from the humidity. I swallowed hard, suddenly realizing how incredibly small and intimate the room felt. I'll make cookies," I blurted out, frantically pivoting toward the kitchen. "Warm ones. And milk. To prevent hypothermia." "I am not hypothermic," he called after me, though his tone was noticeably softer. I spent the next 20 minutes furiously baking a batch of double chocolate chunk cookies, using the repetitive motion of measuring and mixing to stop my hands from shaking. By the time I returned to the parlor with a steaming plate and 2 mugs of warm, honey-sweetened milk, Silas had built a roaring fire in the hearth. He was sitting on the woven rug, his long legs stretched out toward the flames, looking impossibly relaxed. I set the tray down on the low wooden table and knelt on the rug beside him. The storm raged outside, the wind howling against the stone walls, but inside, it was a bubble of golden light and intoxicating warmth. Silas took a warm cookie, the chocolate melting instantly onto his calloused fingers. He ate it in 2 bites, closing his eyes with a quiet sigh of absolute contentment. "You possess a dangerous kind of magic, Penelope," he murmured, looking at the fire. "I am beginning to think you could conquer the capital with nothing but a whisk and an oven." "I have no desire to conquer anything," I replied softly, pulling a soft pink knitted blanket over my knees. "I just want a quiet life." "You deserve one," he said. He turned his head to look at me. The firelight danced across his sharp cheekbones and caught the icy blue of his eyes, turning them into liquid silver. The permanent scowl was completely gone. In its place was an expression of such raw, unguarded affection that my breath hitched. The silence stretched between us, thick and crackling with a sudden, overwhelming tension. The terrifying general, the man I had fled across the country to avoid, was looking at me like I was the most precious thing in the world. He reached out. This time I didn't flinch. Silas's large hand cupped the side of my neck, his thumb lightly brushing the edge of my mob cap. His touch was burning hot, sending a jolt of electricity straight to my heart. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, not by fear, but by a desperate magnetic pull. "Penelope," he whispered, his face inches from mine, his gaze dropping to my lips. Boom! A deafening clap of thunder rattled the windows so hard the teacups on the tray clattered. I jumped backward, practically knocking over my mug of milk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Silas blinked, the spell broken. He slowly withdrew his hand, clearing his throat and shifting his gaze back to the fire. A faint flush crept up his neck. "The storm," he muttered, his voice dropping an octave. "It seems it is worsening." "Yes," I squeaked, clutching the pink blanket to my chest like a shield. "Very stormy." We spent the rest of the night in silence, listening to the rain, the undeniable, terrifying chemistry between us vibrating in the small room. I had successfully avoided the executioner's blade, but as I stole another glance at his handsome, fire-lit face, I knew my heart was entirely doomed. Chapter 9. The morning after the great storm was bright, crisp, and deceptively peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the mint-green curtains of the sugar cloud, catching the sparkling sugar crystals on a fresh tray of vanilla bean scones. I was humming to myself, meticulously arranging a display of pastel-pink macarons, when a gilded, obnoxiously shiny carriage rolled down Oakhaven's main cobblestone street. It pulled to a stop directly outside my bakery. The door opened, and out stepped a vision of radiant, sun-kissed perfection. She had cascading golden curls, large doe-like eyes, and an aura of pure, sickeningly sweet innocence. My humming stopped. The macaron I was holding slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. It was Lady Alara, the original protagonist of the novel, the beloved, flawless heroine who was destined to win the Crown Prince's heart, save the Empire, and indirectly cause my execution. According to the plot, she was supposed to be in the capital, being universally adored. What in the name of all things buttery and good was she doing in my coastal town? A diplomatic holiday, my panicked brain supplied, remembering a vague chapter one had skimmed in my past life. She visits the coast to recover from a minor cold. And right now, the protagonist of my impending doom was looking directly at the pink awnings of the sugar cloud, clapping her hands in delight. She was coming inside. If she saw me, if she recognized the supposedly dead villainous Princess Penelope, my cozy coastal life was over. The Emperor would send an entire armada to drag me back. The brass bell above the door chimed. I didn't think. I simply dropped like a stone, diving behind the solid oak counter, and curling myself into a tight, flour-dusted ball next to a sack of almond flour. "Hello." Alara's melodic, bell-like voice rang out through the shop. "Oh, what a darling little place. Is anyone here?" I squeezed my eyes shut, holding my breath. I couldn't stand up. I absolutely refused. I would live the rest of my life on the floorboards before I let her see me. Suddenly, heavy, familiar boots stepped into the shop. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. General Silas Blackwood had arrived for his afternoon visit, albeit a few hours early. From my vantage point on the floor, I saw his dark leather boots stop abruptly in front of the counter. "General Blackwood," Alara gasped, sounding both terrified and awestruck. "What are you doing so far from the capital?" "Inspecting the perimeter," Silas rumbled, his voice flat and profoundly unenthusiastic. He stepped behind the counter. He looked down. His icy blue eyes met my wide, panicked ones. I was crouching next to a flour sack, clutching a pastry whisk to my chest like a talisman. I wildly shook my head and dragged a finger across my throat in a desperate, "I am dead, do not expose me" gesture. Silas blinked. He looked at me, then looked up at the radiant noblewoman standing in the shop, then back down at me. A faint sigh escaped his lips. He understood the assignment. "The baker," Silas announced to the room, his voice booming with military authority, "is tactically indisposed." "Oh dear," Ilara said, her voice dripping with genuine concern. "Is she unwell?" "She has suffered a catastrophic flour-related incident." Silas lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with me. "I am currently assuming command of this installation." My jaw dropped. "Oh, well, that is very kind of you, General," Ilara chirped. "Could I possibly purchase a box of those lovely little pink cookies? The macarons, I believe they are called." "Negative," Silas stated. Pardon. The pink ones are classified," Silas rumbled, defending his favorite pastries with the ferocity of a dragon guarding its hoard. "You may purchase the scones. 2 copper pieces." From the floorboards, I aggressively waved my hands, mouthing, "Be nice to her. She's the protagonist." Silas frowned down at me, clearly finding my frantic hand signals insubordinate. He looked back up. "I will amend my previous statement. You may have the cupcakes with the daisy frosting. 5 coppers. "But the sign says they are 3 coppers, Ilara noted, confused. "There is a temporary tactical surcharge," Silas replied without missing a beat. I buried my face in my hands. The chief executioner of the Sterling Empire was extorting the heroine of the novel over a batch of vanilla cupcakes. Intimidated by the giant, brooding wall of muscle glaring at her, Ilara hastily slapped 5 copper coins onto the glass counter. Silas meticulously boxed up the cupcakes, tying the pink ribbon with terrifying, aggressive precision, and pushed the box toward her. "Have a secure day," he barked. "Why, you as well, General." Ilara squeaked, practically running out the door. The brass bell jingled merrily as she fled. Silence descended upon the bakery. I slowly peeked my head over the counter. Ilara's carriage was already rolling away down the street. I exhaled a massive breath, slumping against the wooden cabinets in sheer relief. Silas looked down at the cash register, then at the 5 copper coins in his massive, leather-clad hand. He looked immensely pleased with himself. "Threat neutralized," he reported calmly. "You overcharged a noblewoman," I whispered, fighting the hysterical urge to laugh. "I secured additional funding for the bakery," Silas corrected, stepping around the counter and offering me a hand up. As his strong fingers wrapped around mine, pulling me easily to my feet, the humor faded from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, protective intensity. "Who was she to you, Penelope?" he asked quietly. "Why did her presence force you to the floorboards?" My heart pounded. I couldn't tell him the truth. "Not yet. She represents a life I ran away from," I said softly, looking down at our joined hands. "A life that was very dangerous for me." Silas's jaw tightened. His thumb brushed over my knuckles. "She is gone. And if anyone from your past attempts to force you back into danger, they will have to get through me first." I looked up at him, completely overwhelmed. He had just run a pastel cash register to protect my secret. And as I stared into the fierce, unwavering ice of his eyes, I realized that faking my death was the best thing I had ever done. Chapter 10. For 3 days after Lady Ilara's visit, I lived in a state of euphoric delusion. The sun shone brighter, the vanilla sponge cakes rose higher, and I had successfully convinced myself that my past as the doomed second princess was entirely behind me. General Silas Blackwood was no longer just my terrifying bodyguard and most loyal customer. He had become a fixture in my quiet, pastel life. He spent his afternoons in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over his chest plate, watching me bake with an expression of intense, baffling devotion. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The bakery was closed for prep work, and the air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of simmering strawberry compote and melted sugar. "You are using a heavy hand with the vanilla today," Silas rumbled from his usual spot by the door. "Vanilla is the soul of a good tart, General," I replied, standing on my tiptoes to peer into a massive copper mixing bowl. "And since you practically inhale them, I have to ensure the structural integrity of the flavor profile." A soft, low chuckle vibrated from the doorway. It was a sound that still made my heart do a frantic little tap dance against my ribs. "I require the almond flour," I muttered to myself, scanning the counters. I spotted the heavy burlap sack sitting on the very top shelf of the pantry. It was a shelf I usually avoided, but I was determined to finish this batch of macarons before sunset. I dragged my small, notoriously wobbly wooden stool over to the shelves and carefully stepped up. I stretched my arms high, my fingers just barely brushing the rough fabric of the sack. "Allow me," Silas said, stepping into the kitchen. "No, I have it," I insisted, fueled by a sudden, ridiculous burst of independence. I pushed myself higher onto the tips of my toes and gave the sack a firm yank. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The sack was much heavier than I anticipated. As it slid off the shelf, the sudden shift in weight threw me entirely off balance. The wobbly stool groaned, tipped backward, and sent me plummeting toward the hard, checkerboard tiles. I squeezed my eyes shut and braced for a shattered tailbone, a face full of almond flour, or worse. Instead, I hit a solid wall of warm leather and coiled muscle. Silas moved with the blinding speed of a man who had spent his life on a battlefield. His massive arms wrapped securely around my waist and shoulders, catching me in midair with terrifying ease. The heavy sack of almond flour hit the floor beside us, exploding into a soft, powdery cloud. For a moment, all I could do was breathe. My heart hammered wildly against my chest, echoing the frantic, heavy rhythm of Silas's own heart pounding against my back. "I have you," he whispered, his voice dark and breathless, right next to my ear. "Thank you," I gasped. I slowly turned around in his arms to face him, intending to offer a shaky smile. But as I turned, the edge of my oversized, tightly pinned mob cap snagged heavily on the intricate steel buckle of his leather pauldron. There was a sharp tearing sound. The pin snapped. In one horrifying, slow-motion second, the cap was ripped completely from my head. The heavy, striking silver hair I had spent 2 years desperately hiding tumbled down my back in a chaotic, shimmering cascade. But that wasn't the worst part. Without the high collar of the cap to protect me, the neckline of my apron shifted, leaving the side of my neck completely bare, right where the distinctive, star-shaped royal birthmark rested against my collarbone. Silas froze. The gentle, protective warmth in his icy blue eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing shock. His gaze dropped from my face, zeroing in on the silver strands of hair, and then locked onto the birthmark. The silence in the kitchen became absolute, broken only by the quiet bubbling of the strawberry compote on the stove. The air felt like it had been sucked from the room. I stopped breathing. I couldn't move. I was trapped in the arms of the chief executioner, completely and undeniably exposed. Silas's massive hands slowly loosened their grip on my waist, though he didn't step back. He stared at my neck as if looking at a ghost. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered near his temple. When he finally lifted his eyes to meet mine, the devastation and betrayal written in them nearly brought me to my knees. He didn't see the baker anymore. He saw the wanted poster. "The silver hair," Silas whispered, his voice a gravelly, hollow rasp that barely sounded like him. "The star." I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. A tear slipped down my cheek, betraying my absolute terror. Silas took a slow, heavy step backward, putting distance between us. His hand drifted downward, stopping just inches from the hilt of his broadsword. "Penelope," the general breathed, the name no longer a term of endearment but a death sentence. Princess Penelope of the Sterling Empire. The gig was up. The coward had finally been caught. Chapter 11. I closed my eyes, squeezing them so tight that bursts of static color danced behind my eyelids. The moment I had dreaded for 2 entire years had finally arrived. I waited for the unmistakable, terrifying ring of steel as Silas drew his massive broadsword, Mercy, from its scabbard. I braced myself for the cold, heavy hand of the Empire's justice. I was Princess Penelope, the villainess, the traitor. My execution was inevitable. But the sound of drawn steel never came. Instead, there was a deafening crash. I flinched, my eyes flying open. Silas hadn't drawn his sword. Instead, he had slammed his massive, leather-clad fist into the sturdy oak of the prep counter, rattling the copper bowls and sending a cloud of residual almond flour into the air. He was furious. I had seen General Silas Blackwood scowl at aggressive vegetable vendors, and I had seen him intimidate an entire bakery line, but I had never seen him look like this. His chest heaved, his icy blue eyes practically glowing with a volatile, storm-like rage. "Silas, My voice cracked. "I can explain. The treason, the poison, I didn't do it." Well, Penelope did, but I'm not her, not really. Quiet, he snarled, the word tearing out of his throat like a physical weapon. I clamped my mouth shut, tears spilling over my lashes. With trembling hands, I reached behind me. My fingers brushed against a small cooling rack. I picked up a single, perfectly baked strawberry cream tart on a small porcelain plate. I held it out to him, my hands shaking so violently the plate rattled. What? Silas growled, staring at the pastry as if it had offended him. Is that a final request? I whispered, a pathetic sob catching in my throat. Before you take me back to the capital. Or before you use your sword. Please just eat one last tart. So I know we are parting on good terms. For a second, Silas didn't move. Then with a sudden violent motion he swatted his hand through the air. He didn't hit me, but he knocked the porcelain plate clean out of my trembling hands. It shattered against the checkerboard tiles, the strawberry tart ruined in a mess of cream and pastry crumbs. I gasped, shrinking back against the wall. Silas closed the distance between us in a single, terrifying stride. He planted both hands on the wall on either side of my head, caging me in completely. The heat radiating off his body was overwhelming, smelling of leather, rain, and raw adrenaline. You foolish, spectacular coward, he breathed, his face inches from mine. His voice was no longer a roar, but a low, dangerous rumble that shook me to my core. Look at me. I opened my eyes, terrified. Do you honestly believe, Silas demanded, his icy gaze burning into mine, that I care about the Emperor's bounty? Do you think I look at you and see a traitor? I have the birthmark, I stammered. I am the second princess. It is your duty to execute me. My duty is to the Empire, but my soul belongs to me, he fired back fiercely. He reached up, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from my cheek. The contrast between his furious words and his painfully tender touch made my head spin. I have watched you for 2 months, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. I have watched you crochet those pink halter tops with your soft baby wool when you thought no one was looking. I sat in your parlor and watched you read tree night tales by the fire, weeping over fictional folklore characters. You give away day-old bread to the orphans in the square. You apologize to the furniture when you bump into it. He leaned closer, his forehead resting lightly against mine. You are not a villainess, Penelope. You are the baker who gave me back my humanity, Silas murmured, the anger finally draining from his voice, leaving behind nothing but raw, bleeding truth. And if you ever offer me a pastry as a bribe for your own execution again, I will lock you in this kitchen myself. I let out a breathless, watery laugh, my hands coming up to tentatively rest flat against the hard leather of his chest plate. You aren't going to arrest me? I asked, my voice barely a squeak. Arrest you? Silas pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, a dark, fiercely protective smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. Princess or not, if the Emperor's guards want to take you out of this bakery, they are going to have to pull mercy from my cold, dead hands. A fresh wave of tears hit me, but this time, they weren't born of fear. I threw my arms around his neck, burying my face in the crook of his shoulder. Silas wrapped his massive arms around my waist, lifting me off the ground entirely, holding the wanted, doomed princess of the Sterling Empire, as if she were his most fiercely guarded treasure. Chapter 12. Once the initial adrenaline faded, and the shattered remains of the strawberry tart were swept up from the floorboards, reality came crashing back in. Silas might not want to execute me, but the Emperor's bounty was still very real, and very active. We relocated to the back parlor. I sat on my plush cream-colored sofa, clutching a mug of heavily sugared tea, while Silas paced the length of the small room. Without his armor, he moved with the silent, restless energy of a caged panther. The scouts in the market were a preliminary sweep, Silas stated, his brow furrowed in a deep, tactical scowl. If they have circulated your wanted poster this far to the coast, it means the Emperor's intelligence network suspects you did not drown in the Way River 2 years ago. They will eventually search every house in Oakhaven. I took a shaky sip of my tea. So I have to run again? I can pack. I have a lot of flour, but I can leave it. You are not running, Silas interrupted, stopping in front of the fireplace. He turned to face me, his massive frame silhouetted against the flames. Running implies you are prey. You are not prey, Penelope. You are under my protection. Silas, you are one man, I pointed out gently. A very large, very terrifying man with a giant sword, yes. But the emperor has legions. Which is why we will not fight them with steel, he replied smoothly, a dangerous, calculated gleam appearing in his icy blue eyes. We will fight them with bureaucracy. I blinked. Bureaucracy? Like, aggressive filing? Silas reached into his leather tunic and withdrew a folded piece of thick parchment and a charcoal pencil. He sat down on the sturdy wooden chair opposite my sofa, flattened the parchment on the low table, and began writing with swift, aggressive strokes. The Sterling Empire was founded on military might, Silas explained without looking up. As such, the highest-ranking generals are granted certain immutable privileges by the crown. One of those privileges is the law of sanctuary. I don't remember that from my political history tutors, I admitted, wrapping my pink knitted blanket tighter around my shoulders. Because it is an obscure military clause, Silas said, signing his name at the bottom with a forceful flourish. He pushed the parchment across the table toward me. Read it. I leaned forward. The handwriting was sharp and jagged, exactly what you would expect from a man who used a broadsword to solve most of his problems. I, General Silas Blackwood, Chief Executioner of the Sterling Empire, do hereby claim the law of sanctuary for Lady Penelope, by the sacred rights of the High Command. She is legally bound to my house, granting her absolute, irrevocable immunity from all prior imperial decrees, bounties, and accusations of treason. My eyes scanned down to the final line, and my heart completely stopped. As my lawfully wedded wife, I stared at the word wife until the letters started to blur. I looked up at Silas. He was sitting completely still, his icy blue eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made the crackling fire feel cold. A marriage contract, I whispered, my voice incredibly small. A contract of convenience, Silas corrected swiftly, though a faint, treacherous pink dusted the tips of his ears. A purely tactical maneuver. If you are my wife, you are untouchable. The emperor himself cannot bypass the law of sanctuary without declaring war on his own military high command. But marriage? I squeaked. To the chief executioner? It is a formality to ensure your survival, Silas said, crossing his heavy arms over his chest. He looked everywhere except directly at me. You will continue to run your bakery. I will continue my duties. We will simply share a legal surname. You will be entirely safe. I looked back down at the parchment. I was a coward. I was absolutely terrified of the emperor's assassins and the dungeon. A fake marriage to the most powerful man in the realm was the ultimate shield. It was the logical, safe choice. And yet, as I picked up the charcoal pencil, my hand trembled for a completely different reason. It was supposed to be a fake contract. But the way Silas was watching me, like I was the only light in his dark, blood-soaked world, felt dangerously real. You are certain? I asked softly, the charcoal hovering over the dotted line. Tying yourself to a wanted traitor could ruin your reputation. Silas let out a low, scoffing rumble. Penelope, I am the most feared man in the empire. My reputation is built on terror. If marrying a pastel-obsessed baker who apologizes to furniture ruins it, then so be it. I couldn't fight the smile that broke across my face. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the charcoal to the parchment and signed my name next to his. The moment the pencil lifted from the page, Silas exhaled a breath he sounded like he had been holding for an hour. He didn't just look relieved, he looked utterly, triumphantly thrilled. He stood up, snatched the contract from the table, and carefully tucked it into his tunic, as if it were a priceless artifact. Pack your bags, he commanded, his deep voice suddenly brimming with authoritative energy. What? Why? You just said I didn't have to run. We are not running, General Silas Blackwood stated, a genuine, devastatingly handsome smirk finally breaking through his permanent scowl. But my fiancé cannot sleep in a drafty parlor. You are relocating to the garrison commander's estate. We have a wedding to plan. Chapter 13. Relocating to the garrison commander's estate was exactly what you would expect when a pastel-obsessed baker moves in with the Empire's most lethal military asset. Within 3 days, I had completely compromised the tactical integrity of Silas's stark, iron-wrought fortress. I hung soft blush curtains over the arrow slits. I placed vases of fresh daisies on the weapon racks. And most importantly, I commandeered the massive, industrial-sized garrison kitchens to bake my own wedding cake. Penelope, you are the bride. You should not be covered in flour 24 hours before the ceremony, Silas rumbled. He was leaning against the heavy stone archway of the kitchen, watching me work. The past month of planning, our fake marriage had been a whirlwind of frantic baking, dress fittings, and Silas glaring at anyone who dared to question the sudden nuptials. I trust no one else with the sponge, Silas, I called out, furiously whisking a massive bowl of vanilla buttercream. Francois across the street offered to cater, and I nearly threw a rolling pin at him. It's my wedding. It must be perfect. It is a contractual ceremony to secure your legal immunity, Silas corrected, though his voice lacked its usual commanding bite. I paused, resting my whisk against the edge of the copper bowl. I looked over at him. For a man entering a fake marriage, Silas was taking it terribly seriously. He had personally overseen the guest list, ensuring only the most trusted officers and loyal townsfolk were invited. He had spent an absurd amount of gold on a dress made of spun silver and blush silk. And just yesterday, I had caught him carefully polishing his ceremonial armor until it gleamed like a dark mirror. Silas, I said softly, wiping my hands on my apron and walking over to him. If this is just a tactical maneuver, why did you order the seamstress to embroider intertwining sugar daisies and swords onto my veil? Silas stiffened. The tips of his ears turned a brilliant shade of crimson. He looked down at me, his towering frame casting a protective shadow over me in the busy kitchen. Because, he muttered, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, tactics require attention to detail. Right, I smiled, stepping closer until I had to tilt my head back to look into his icy blue eyes. And what about the fact that you haven't let go of my hand in public for 3 weeks? He slowly reached out, wrapping his large, callous fingers around my waist and pulling me flush against his chest. The heavy, comforting scent of leather and rain completely overwhelmed the smell of the baking cake. That, Silas breathed, his gaze dropping to my lips, is to establish a credible cover story. You are a terrible liar, General, I whispered. And you are a spectacular coward, he replied softly. But you are going to marry me anyway. He didn't wait for my response. Silas leaned down and kissed me. It wasn't the harsh, commanding kiss of an executioner. It was devastatingly tender, slow, and sweet, tasting faintly of the vanilla sugar I had been working with all morning. My knees instantly turned to jelly. I melted against him, entirely forgetting about the 3-tiered sponge cake baking in the oven. Completely surrendering to the man I had once crossed an empire to escape. When he finally pulled away, resting his forehead against mine, there was no more talk of contracts, laws of sanctuary, or tactical maneuvers. I am going to keep you safe, Penelope, Silas murmured, his thumbs gently stroking my flour-dusted cheeks. For the rest of our lives. Epilogue. 5 years later. The little brass bell above the door of the sugar cloud chimed merrily, but the sound was completely drowned out by the bustling chatter of a packed house. The bakery had tripled in size. We had knocked down the wall to the adjacent building, expanding the pastel haven to accommodate the sheer volume of customers. Oakhaven had become a booming tourist destination, largely because people traveled from across the empire just to see if the rumors were true. I stood behind the glass display case, carefully placing the final pink sugar daisy on a massive tray of strawberry cream tarts. I pushed a stray lock of silver hair out of my face, smiling as Mrs. Higgins practically vibrated with excitement at the front of the line. They look lovelier than ever, Lady Blackwood, she chirped. Thank you, Mrs. Higgins, I laughed, boxing up her order. The title still felt surreal, but I wore it proudly. The Emperor, faced with the undeniable fury of his entire high command if he challenged the law of sanctuary, had eventually grumbled, issued a formal pardon, and completely given up on trying to execute me. Being married to the most terrifying man in the realm had its perks. Speaking of my terrifying husband, I wiped my hands on a towel and pushed through the swinging wooden doors into the massive back kitchen. There, standing over a heavy steel mixing bowl, was General Silas Blackwood. He was still built like a mountain, his broad shoulders and thick, heavily muscled arms stretching the limits of his linen shirt. His dark hair was tied back, and his permanent, brooding scowl was deeply etched into his face as he stared down into the bowl with the intensity of a man planning a military siege. He was aggressively, violently whisking egg whites. And tied securely around his massive waist, over his dark trousers, was a soft pink apron covered in a delicate pattern of blooming cherry blossoms. Are the peaks forming, General? I asked, leaning against the doorframe, trying very hard not to laugh. Silas didn't stop whisking. The metal wire was a blur of motion. The structural integrity of this meringue is stubborn, Penelope. But it will yield. I will break its spirit. You're intimidating the eggs, Silas. You have to be gentle with them. He stopped, pulling the whisk up. The egg whites formed a perfect glossy, stiff peak. He let out a triumphant, rumbling grunt, looking immensely pleased with himself. Victory, he declared. I walked over to him, wrapping my arms around his waist from behind and resting my cheek against his broad back. He instantly relaxed, turning around and wrapping me in a massive, encompassing hug, careful not to get meringue on my dress. He kissed the top of my head, a deep, contented sigh vibrating in his chest. Is the front line secure? Silas asked softly, resting his chin on my hair. The strawberry tarts are deployed and the civilians are happy, I reported. He smiled, a rare, genuine expression that he still reserved entirely for me. The chief executioner of the Sterling Empire had traded his broadsword for a whisk, and his battlefield for a pastel bakery. And as I looked up at the man who had terrified me into falling in love with him, I knew that my days of being a coward were officially, and happily, over. That's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.